closed. In reality, the United States Marshals had to relocate Henry Hill 4 separate times because he kept blowing his own cover, sometimes within hours of arriving in a new city. When the government finally gave up on him and stripped away his protection entirely, leaving him completely exposed to every crime family that wanted him dead, the Mafia's response was the last thing anyone expected. To understand how it all fell apart, Henry Hill did not become a government witness out of guilt. He flipped because Jimmy Burke was killing everyone connected to the Lufthansa heist, and Henry knew he was next. The feds offered a deal. He took it, but even while negotiating for his life, Henry could not help himself. He asked the U.S. Marshals if he could bring 2 of his mistresses into the witness protection program alongside his wife Karen and their 2 children. The Marshals said no. The evacuation was nothing like the calm suburban transition the movie suggests. There were no moving trucks. There was no packing timeline. In May of 1980, U.S. Marshals showed up and told Greg, who was 13, and Gina, who was 11, to cases, hefty bags, the kind you use for yard waste. Greg had to choose which parts of his childhood fit inside a trash bag and leave the rest behind forever. That night, the Hill family vanished from New York without saying goodbye to a single person they knew. Their grandparents, their cousins, their school friends, all gone in a matter of hours. The children were given no explanation of where they were going or when, if ever, they might come back. And what happened next set the tone for the entire disaster that followed. The Marshals dropped the Hill family in Omaha, Nebraska, a quiet, anonymous city in the middle of the country where nobody would think to look for a mob informant. On the very first night in their new, hidden life, Henry decided to take the whole family out to dinner. The restaurant he chose was a local chain called Godfather's Pizza. A man hiding from the actual godfather of the Lucchese crime family, eating at a place with the word Godfather in neon above the door. Omaha. The Hill family stuck out in Omaha the way a limousine sticks out in a parking lot full of pickup trucks. Brooklyn accents in a restaurant full of polite Midwesterners. Henry got drunk, talked loud, and basically put a spotlight on a family that was supposed to be invisible. The kids sat there watching their father act exactly the way he acted back in Queens. Greg and Gina, 2 kids who had just been ripped from everything they knew, were already learning the central lesson of life with their father. Henry Hill could not stop being Henry Hill, no matter how many times the government changed his name. But the Godfather's Pizza incident was just the appetizer. Instead of keeping his head down in Nebraska, Henry started walking to local payphones to collect calls back to his mob contacts in New York City. Thousands of dollars to hide, was voluntarily reaching out to the exact people who wanted to put a bullet in him. Every single one of those phone calls put his wife and his children directly on the Mafia's radar. Godfathers. And back in New York, someone was listening. Jimmy Burke had been overheard whispering inside a federal courthouse that he knew Henry was somewhere in the Midwest. The bounty on Henry's head was rumored to have climbed as high as $2 million. When the U.S. Marshals caught wind of this, they panicked. The family was loaded into a government sedan and were evacuated in an emergency to Independence, Kentucky in the middle of the night. 2 million. However, the quiet Kentucky countryside didn't slow Henry down at all. If anything, it just gave him a fresh audience to con. Within weeks of arriving in Independence, the Turfway Park racetrack had a new regular. Henry wasn't just placing bets. He ran full-scale betting scams, cultivated connections with local gamblers, and explored every angle the track had to offer. Somehow, he even managed to get tangled up in a shady business deal with the state governor, though the details of that arrangement remain murky to this day. And then there was the horse. In a move that would get laughed out of a pitch meeting for being too ridiculous, an actual racehorse named Banana Split was shipped across the country to Kentucky for his daughter. Think about that. A protected federal witness living under a fake name with a $2 million bounty on his head, importing a registered horse across state lines while Jimmy Burke's people were actively canvassing the Midwest. The marshals were trying to keep this man alive, and he was leaving a paper trail that a child could follow. Then he topped even that. Living under his government-issued alias Martin Lewis, Henry met a young woman named Sherry Anders in 1981. He didn't tell her his real name. He didn't tell her about the mob, the murders, or the witness protection program. And he certainly didn't tell her that he already had a wife and 2 children living in that exact same federal program. Henry married Sherry at a wedding chapel in Virginia City, Nevada. He committed federal bigamy while the American taxpayer funded his protection. But the racetrack scams and the secret marriage were not even close to the worst part of this story. What happened inside the Hill household behind the front door of a quiet suburban home was the real nightmare that witness protection created. In 2004, Greg and Gina Hill published a memoir called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood. What they described was devastating. Greg stated that the witness protection program did not save their family. It trapped them inside a house with a violent, out-of-control father that they had no way of escaping. Back in New York, the kids at least had grandparents, neighbors, and familiar streets where they could find some kind of normalcy. In Witsec, they had nothing. They were completely isolated in unfamiliar towns, surrounded by strangers, with a man whose behavior was getting worse by the month. The children knew about the mob bounties. They understood, even as kids, that people with real money and real guns were actively trying to find their father. Greg and Gina slept with baseball bats next to their beds, fully expecting Luke's hitmen to kick down their door in the middle of the night. These were children living like hostages in their own home. Henry himself was a raging, physically abusive alcoholic with a severe cocaine addiction that he made zero effort to hide. Greg described seeing hefty trash bags entirely stuffed with marijuana sitting out in the open in the family living room. Henry would disappear for days on benders, come back violent, and the children learned to read his moods the way animals learn to read weather. When Henry was quiet, something bad was coming. When Henry was loud, something bad was already happening. This was a man who had been given a second chance at life by the federal government, and he was using it to run drugs out of the same house where his kids were trying to do homework. The violence was not abstract or occasional. Greg would later describe having to physically step between his parents during fights, a teenage boy trying to shield his mother from a man who had spent his entire adult life around people who solved problems with their fists. The family existed in a constant state of siege from 2 directions at once. Outside the house, the mob was hunting them. Inside the house, their father was the threat nobody could protect them from. And that was just the daily reality. The larger pattern was even worse. Karen Hill, for her part, was far from an innocent bystander. According to her own children, Karen actively helped Henry hide drugs and money from the marshals, coached the kids on what to say during check-ins, and maintained the fiction that the family was following the program's rules while Henry ran scams and drank himself into violent rages every night. The dysfunction was not just Henry, it was the whole machine. The psychological damage was absolute. Every few months, the marshals would relocate them again. New town, new school, new fake names, new lies to tell new classmates. Greg and Gina would start building friendships, start feeling something close to normal. And then the phone would ring and everything would evaporate overnight. They would be in a car heading to another anonymous suburb, starting the whole miserable cycle from scratch. The breaking point came when Greg was 19 years old, after years of absorbing his father's violence, after years of protecting his mother, after years of living in constant fear of both the mob and the man sitting across the dinner table. Greg made the only decisions that could save his life. He left. He changed his name, severed every single tie to his family, and disappeared. The Witness Protection Program was supposed to protect the Hill children from organized crime. Instead, it locked them in a cage with the most dangerous person in their world. And the relocations still were not over. The Marshalls eventually moved what was left of the family to Redmond, Washington, a small town near Seattle. Henry, attempting to blend in with the flannel-wearing Pacific Northwest crowd, came up with a plan that was pure Henry Hill. He bought brand new lumberjack shirts from a store, then walked into a local Goodwill and traded them for worn-out, faded ones. He said he learned the trick from undercover NYPD cops. That was his version of going incognito. Flannel shirts could not disguise the fact that Henry was still dealing drugs. In 1987, he violated the one rule the Witness Protection Program absolutely could not forgive. He set up a narcotics pipeline and got caught attempting to sell a pound of cocaine to undercover DEA agents in the Seattle area, a full pound. This was not a guy buying an 8-ball for personal use. This was distribution-level trafficking run by a man the federal government was actively paying to protect. The government had tolerated the blown covers, the payphone calls to New York, the racetrack scams, the bigamy, and the domestic chaos for 7 years. They could not tolerate their star witness running a cocaine trafficking operation on the federal dime. Henry Hill was officially expelled from the Witness Protection Program. The shield that had kept him alive since 1980 was gone. Karen filed for divorce in 1990, though the paperwork dragged on until 2002 before it was finalized. She and the children kept their government aliases and vanished into permanent hiding without Henry. He was alone, exposed, and completely unprotected for the first time since he walked into that FBI field office. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I cover the real endings behind famous cases every week, the parts that get left out of the movies. Because here is the part that makes this entire story land differently than you would expect. After everything, after the betrayals and the blown covers and the bounty and the cocaine, the Mafia simply did not kill him. By the late 90s and the 2000s, Henry was living completely in the open under his real name, not hiding, not laying low, calling into the Howard Stern show while blackout drunk, slurring stories about Jimmy Burke like it was a party trick. He showed up on cable news specials about the Mafia, grinning at cameras, talking about people who would have killed him a decade earlier, and the business ventures were even more absurd. A restaurant in West Haven, Connecticut called Wise Guys opened and then closed after 1 month because of a fire. His own brand of marinara sauce, Sunday Gravy, sold on the internet. Amateur mob-themed paintings listed on eBay for whatever anyone would pay. The man who inspired one of the greatest crime films ever made was hawking pasta sauce and watercolors for beer money. The most famous rat in American organized crime was wandering around in broad daylight, putting his name on pasta jars and doing drunken radio call-ins, and nobody from the old life lifted a finger. So why didn't they touch him? Because the men who wanted Henry Hill dead were already gone. Paul Vario, the Lucchese captain who ran Henry for decades, died in a federal prison cell in 1988. Jimmy Burke, the man behind a bounty of $2 million, died behind bars in 1996. Tommy DeSimone, the real-life inspiration for Joe Pesci's character in the film, had been dead since 1979. The crime families themselves had been gutted. The Lucchese's and the Gambinos spent the entire 80s and 90s getting dismantled by federal RICO prosecutions. Boss after boss went down, entire crews got locked up. By the time Henry was walking around using his real name on national radio, the organizations that once would have spent any amount of money to silence a rat were barely holding themselves together. The old guard was dead or in prison, and the new generation had bigger problems than some washed-up informant selling marinara sauce. On top of all that, look at what Henry Hill had actually become. He was a broke, severely addicted man selling pasta sauce on the internet and painting watercolors of mobsters for beer money, assassinating the man who inspired one of the most famous crime films in history. Would have brought an avalanche of FBI attention down on whatever remained of organized crime in New York. And for what? Henry was no longer a threat to anyone. He had no information left to give. He was already destroying himself more effectively than any hitman ever could. So the mob did something far more brutal than putting a contract on him. They ignored him. They let him sit in his own wreckage, fading into irrelevance, until his body finally gave out. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, one day after his 69th birthday, in a Los Angeles hospital. Heart failure. Years of cocaine, alcohol, and hard living had finally caught up with him. His girlfriend, Lisa Caserta, told CBS that he went out peacefully. For a good fella. His children, Greg and Gina, were still living under their government aliases somewhere in the United States. Karen had long since built a new life under her own assumed name. The family Henry dragged through witness protection never Henry did. Goodfellas gave you a punchline about egg noodles. The real ending was 4 decades of chaos that the Mafia didn't even need to help along. If you want to see what really happened to the Lufthansa heist money that started this whole disaster, that video is on screen now.